Fats, oils, cholesterol. I mean, you hear these words thrown around all the time, right? But what if I told you they're all basically part of the same big biological family? It's true, they're all lipids. And today, we're going to unpack that family tree to see exactly how a simple cooking oil is related to the very building blocks of our cells.
So here's our game plan. First, we'll figure out the one secret rule that makes a lipid. Then, we'll get to know the four main branches of the family, starting with the simple stuff and moving to the more complex players. By the end of this, you'll have a complete roadmap to this whole group of molecules.
Okay, so let's tackle the biggest question first. If this lipid family is so incredibly diverse, what's the one thing, the one trait that ties them all together? The answer is probably not what you're thinking.
You'd think the definition would be some super complicated chemical formula, right? But it's not. It's actually all about behavior. The single unifying rule every lipid follows is just this: it does not like water. It's hydrophobic. That's it. That one simple property, the fact that they don't dissolve in water, is the common thread connecting everything from butter to beeswax to cholesterol.
Okay, so now that we've got our main rule down, lipids hate water, let's look at how scientists organize this huge family. It really helps to think of it like a map with four main territories, which we're about to explore one by one.
And here they are: simple, complex, derived, and a kind of catch-all group called miscellaneous. Makes sense, right? Let's start at the beginning with the simple lipids.
First up, we've got the foundation of the entire family, simple lipids. Let's see what makes them tick.
You know, the recipe for a simple lipid is surprisingly, well, simple. It's just two basic ingredients. You take some fatty acids and you combine them with an alcohol. That's the core structure we're going to see over and over.
And the most famous simple lipids of all? You guessed it, fats and oils. You might also hear them called triglycerides. These guys are a huge deal in our bodies. They're the most plentiful type of lipid in animals, and they're basically our body's go-to method for storing energy for later. The recipe is just what we saw: fatty acids plus a specific kind of alcohol called glycerol.
So what's the actual difference between a fat, like butter, and an oil, like olive oil? You'd think it's some massive chemical thing, but honestly, it's way easier than that. It just comes down to whether it's a solid or a liquid when you leave it out on your counter. That's literally the whole difference.
Now, the second type of simple lipid is wax. The basic recipe is exactly the same: fatty acids plus an alcohol. But for waxes, the alcohol part is a much bigger, more complex molecule than the glycerol we saw in fats. That different alcohol backbone is what gives them their unique waxy properties, which is why they show up in all sorts of stuff, like cosmetics.
All right, we've got this simple foundation down. So what happens when you take one of those simple lipids and you give it an upgrade? You bolt on an extra part. Well, that's when you get our second category, the complex lipids.
This chart lays it out perfectly. See, you start with that simple lipid base of fatty acid and alcohol, and then you just add one more thing. If you add a phosphate group, boom, you've got a phospholipid. If you add a carbohydrate, it becomes a glycolipid. And if you attach a protein, you get a lipoprotein. That one little addition completely changes its job.
Let's just zoom in on phospholipids for a quick second. Okay, yeah, the names here look a little intense, but the idea is pretty straightforward. They're just sorted into two main buckets based on which alcohol they use for their backbone. If the alcohol is glycerol, they're glycerophospholipids. If it's a different one called sphingosine, well, they're sphingosphospholipids. The main thing to remember is just that the alcohol base can change.
Next up, glycolipids. That glyco part is your clue. It means there's a carbohydrate, a sugar, attached. You find these all over the place, but they're super important in our cell membranes, especially for our nerve cells and brain tissue.
And now for a term I bet you've heard at a doctor's visit: lipoproteins. This is where LDL and HDL, the famous bad and good cholesterol, come from. I mean, think about it. Lipids hate water, but our blood is mostly water, so how do they get around? They have to get packaged into these little lipoprotein taxis to get carried through our bloodstream.
Okay, let's move on to our last two branches. This is where we find all the byproducts, the leftovers, and some of the other interesting outliers of the lipid world. Now, this category is really fascinating. Derived lipids aren't built from scratch. They're what you get when you break down simple and complex lipids. And just look at what's in this group. It's not just the basic parts like fatty acids and glycerol. We're talking about crucial things like steroids, cholesterol, and the essential fat-soluble vitamins A, D, E, and K. This is an absolute powerhouse of a category.
And finally, we have our catch-all group, miscellaneous lipids. Basically, these are compounds that don't really fit into the other structural families, but they still follow that number one rule: they don't dissolve in water. This is where you find things like carotenoids, you know, the pigments that make carrots orange.
Okay, we've officially toured the entire family tree, so let's just do a quick recap to make sure this whole roadmap is crystal clear.
So let's put it all together one last time. Everything starts with simple lipids, that basic two-part recipe. Then you add another piece to them and they become complex. You break those down into their components and you get the incredibly important derived lipids. And pretty much everything else that just happens to hate water gets tossed into the miscellaneous group. That's the entire family tree in a nutshell.
When you really step back and look at it, it's pretty incredible. Molecules as different as the fat we use for energy, the hormones that run our bodies, and the vitamins that keep us alive, they're all part of this one big family. They're all either built from or broken down from that same simple lipid foundation. It really leaves you with a final thought. What does that tell us about the amazing power hidden inside a simple chemical backbone?